Welcome to Davos Direct right here on ET Now as we continue to cover the World Economic Forum in this beautiful ski resort of Switzerland. I'm Supriya, Shrinate, and let's kick off the show with all the international headlines, the new global context, and what is the world really losing sleep over. One of the pockets of turbulence is China, and we did get in a word from Nouriel Roubini, the man who's known to mince no words. He believes China is going to grow at less than 6%, and that obviously is not soft but hard landing. He believes this is going to have an obvious impact on emerging markets and will also impact commodity exporters like Australia. Let's get your slice of the conversation with Nouriel Roubini.
My main concern is that China is not doing the reforms that are required to move from fixed investment to consumption fast enough. They're not going to have a hard landing, but they're not going to have even a soft landing. I believe the growth by next year is going to be below 6%. It's better to have a bumpy or a rough landing.
6%?
Below 6%.
How does your China scenario play out in the global economy?
China is today the second largest economy in the world. So if the slowdown of China were to be more than expected, it has significant impact on commodity exporters, falling price in iron ore, industrial metals, copper. It affects both emerging markets and advanced economies like Australia that are commodity exporters. Trade links in Asia are important, and that slowdown of China is going to be negative for parts of the newly industrialized economies in Asia as well.
After the upgrade of the U.S. economy by the IMF, are you still sticking to your forecast of a rate rise in Q3?
Yes, I stick with that forecast because earlier than that it could be maybe in June, but there is a problem. Growth is improving, labor market is improving, but because of the oil price shock, now prices are starting to fall. Even the U.S. is going to be near deflation. Core inflation is going to fall sharply. So how can the Fed start hiking rates, say in June as opposed to September, when inflation is falling quite sharply? They'll have to wait just a little bit longer.
The Swiss National Bank surprised the markets last week with their FX policy shift. Do you think that means that we'll have a growing lack of trust in central banks?
People are questioning whether the central banks are able to avoid deflation and jumpstart economic growth. We've tried zero policy rates, even negative deposit rates, quantitative easing, credit easing, forward guidance.
We've tried everything.
The Swiss National Bank was doing a form of quantitative easing by doing unlimited, unsterilized foreign exchange rate intervention. They've lost this battle, and right now there is a risk to financial stability, a risk of debt deflation in the case of Switzerland. So they're challenged. After all these years of trying unconventional monetary policy, we're still having anemic growth and we're in need of deflation.
But do you think that that will muddy the waters for the way that people look at central banks as a whole?
Not yet, because some central banks have been quite aggressive. The U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, even the Bank of England, and now we expect that even the European Central Bank is going to try to jumpstart growth in the Eurozone.
The ECB is expected to do QE this week. What do you think the impact of that will be?
QE alone is not sufficient. Even Mario Draghi said that the Eurozone has a problem with a lack of aggregate demand. To increase aggregate demand, you need monetary easing, you need credit easing, but you also need some temporary fiscal stimulus. Unfortunately, Germany is against that fiscal stimulus for the Eurozone and for Germany, and therefore the impact of quantitative easing by the ECB is not going to be as strong as it would be with the right fiscal policy.
The other part of the world that continues to dominate headlines is indeed Europe. Deflationary trends on the periphery and truckloads of expectations against Mario Draghi to do the rescue act. The question is, how aggressive can Mario Draghi really get in his ECB policy tomorrow? And the bigger question is, will monetary stimulus be able to rescue an economy that's shaping around very, very fractious polity? We got an expert take with Thomas Nides, the Vice Chairman of Morgan Stanley, right here on ET Now.
Unlike the United States, where we have one Fed, he has 17 countries in which to work through with the EU. I think he's doing a job trying to bring along countries of all different economic positions. What the number is going to be basically a decision of the markets. Will decide if it's bold enough, aggressive enough. It's maybe may not actually be the amount he announces, but how forward-leaning he is about other continual actions that he may take. Part of this is a momentum play. Part of this is creating the momentum in the markets that monetary policy will begin in helping kickstart some of the economies and start kicking the economies in some of the countries that are hurting. Again, I think it is very hard to do to some extent, but I think Draghi is focused on using the quantitative easing measures that he has, and I think there's been general buy-in among the EU partners in which to show something fairly aggressive.
The Wall believes that the U.S. has been the single engine of growth pre-crisis. Do you believe that situation can continue? Is U.S. dominant enough to do that, even though pockets of trouble exist in Europe, China, and other parts of the world?
Well, I think, listen, the United States plays a very big role. Obviously, we're a massive trade partner. We're a massive exporter. We have the capacity to be an engine, but we can't do this alone. And obviously why Secretary Liu, the Treasury Secretary, encouraged and with a lot of force for the European, certainly Mr. Draghi and the ECB to take some fairly drastic measures to try to boost the economy. No, the United States cannot do it alone. Listen, China's growth at 6.5–7%, I feel pretty confident about China's growth and China's growth opportunities. And if you look around the economy, again, I think it is some countries are growing slower than others, some are growing fast, but I do think the United States is a fairly clear measurement of what the possibilities are for growth around the world.
When realistically do you expect the Fed to act on interest rates? Your internal reports seem to suggest it is not going to happen before middle of 2015.
At some point, interest rates are going to go up. It's good for the market. It's good for the economy. Will it be in the third quarter or the fourth quarter? I have no idea. If I knew, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd be trading on it. But I think generally, I think there's a general sense in the marketplace that the direction is to move rates up over the short term, and when that will be, again, I don't know, year end, middle of the year. I think they're looking at the markets as you and I are.
When Lloyd's of London talks about insurance, the world indeed sits up and takes notice, and which is why when John Nelson, the chairman of Lloyd, says that India and China is where he envisages to set up mini Lloyds, the matter is rather heartening. He's giving a huge thumbs up to the Indian government for opening up FDI and insurance, but is not satisfied with ordinance just yet. He wants to await the Parliament's nod before deciding to put in the big bucks. We also spoke to him about the global growth trends and, of course, the whole talk about an interest rate hike in the United States.
Markets in South America, Latin America, Middle East, as well as India, Southeast Asia and China are all important. So we take them all very seriously.
The Indian government has moved on reforms as far as insurance sector FDI is concerned. This has, of course, happened via the FDI route, ordinance route, and they're still awaiting the Parliament's approval. I have a question to ask of you. Does this ordinance route inspire confidence for people like you to look at India with renewed interest, or would you rather wait for the Parliament to give its final nod?
We have been looking at India, as you may know, for a very long time. We are very keen that we should come onshore in India with the Lloyd's market. We've seen the ordinance, which is helpful, but we are waiting now for the Act, and we're very hopeful that that Act will be passed during the first half of 2015. In the meantime, we are discussing with the regulators, the IRDA, the detail of the regulations that will surround the introduction of international reinsurance into the Indian market.
What about India disappoints you? It's a great market out there waiting to be penetrated, but what is it about India that continues to disappoint you?
Very little. I think the Indian economy is you can see, is robust, it's strong. You have a business-friendly political leadership. The slight frustration has been the time that it has taken to introduce this insurance amendment bill, which has had the support not just of this government but the previous government, but it's been difficult to get it through Parliament, and we're hopeful that this will now happen.
And how exactly does India compare vis-à-vis China in the insurance landscape?
They're two very different markets. The Chinese market obviously is potentially the biggest market in the world, and India is just behind. I would say that the Chinese government are very keen to internationalize their own domestic insurance industry. We very much hope if we can get onshore access into India that we will find Indian carriers internationalizing themselves and using the Lloyd's platform.
Talk about the sectors that insurance sector, especially Lloyd's, will be looking at exploring all of 2015. Which ones would those be?
As the world is developing, you've got higher geopolitical risk, you've got climate change where you can see changes in weather patterns, you can see cyber security and the impact that that has, and in terms of as countries continue to commercialize and industrialize, they're creating more and more B2B risk. So all of those areas we see as very important that we continue to innovate in and we develop.
It's a bad neighborhood to be in, and that's perhaps why a lot of global CEOs believe that economic recovery will not be good. But guess what? Indian CEOs are far, far more optimistic. Almost 62% of them believe that economic recovery will be there. It will be robust. That's according to the 18th PwC Global CEO Survey. In an exclusive chat with your channel, Dennis Nally, the global chairman of PwC, insists that the budget is going to be the big game changer, the tool to bring in economic reforms, and that's the one document that the world is keeping a very close eye on.
The shift of the global economy from the developed world to the developing world is a trend that's not reversible. It may have slowed, but it's not reversible.
According to your survey, what are the biggest areas of concern as far as Europe is concerned? The lack of political buy-in as far as economic solutions go, or the fact that there are deflationary trends? What is worrying CEOs most in Europe?
Well, I think there's a lack of alignment around the economic and monetary policies that really need to be implemented within that part of the world. And so, until you can get that kind of economic alignment, the CEOs are essentially saying they're looking at, an environment that is essentially, flat to potentially 1% growth for the near term. So it's going to be very interesting to see, how Draghi's proposals not only are received, but whether or not there's an appetite to move in a direction that is very different than many of the countries in Europe, have wanted to go in the past.
BRICS as a single entity of economic growth or economic model is not really what has survived, and is perhaps it's time, you haven't said it, but others around the world have, it's time to drop the B and the R from the BRICS because it's really India and China.
Whenever an economy is going through massive changes and reforms, which is what we all know about in China, that creates uncertainty. And I think that speaks directly to the decrease in confidence levels that the CEOs have for that particular, economy as we go forward. Having said that, they're still growing pretty nicely. And I think many economies around the world would like to have that growth rate. So you have to put everything in context. You have to have that starting point. I am one who has always believed in India. I think it's got an incredibly bright future. When I think about the population, I think about demographics, education, language, all of those factors. So I, for one, believe. I think there is a euphoria with the new government. I think there are incredibly high expectations that the new government is going to get onto the reform agenda. I think most are very optimistic that he will. I think this upcoming budget is going to be a very interesting test of that. And I, for one, am hopeful that the reforms that have been talked about will actually begin to get implemented, executed, over the next several months.
On that note, we've got to take a quick breather here, but we come back and talk to two of the tallest leaders of India, Sunil Mittal in an exclusive conversation, and a rare one at that in telecom, and of course Uday Kotak on the whole India growth story and what Raghuram Rajan has just done. Welcome back. You're watching Davos Direct right here on ET Now. He's really called the original poster boy of Indian telecom. And yes, indeed, I'm referring to Sunil Bharti Mittal. Now, contrary to what many people think, he's not losing unnecessary sleep over the scarcity-induced spectrum auctions. He, though, believes that the staggered 3G auctions are not going to be such a big blow for his sector. But he does caution that higher spectrum cost will immediately result in higher tariffs. Mr. Mittal doesn't seem to be too unnerved by competition that's coming in from Mukesh Ambani, because he insists that Reliance will be one of the 3 to 4 operators, along with Bharti Airtel, to develop the 4G landscape. Let's get you a slice of the conversation with Sunil Bharti Mittal.
Telecom has had its own set of problems. If you look at it, 2008, 2010 was a turning point when lots of licenses were given. Fractionalization of spectrum happened. You gave tiny amounts of spectrum to so many people who till date are not putting it to use. And the large operators got starved of the very vital resource of spectrum. And then, of course, came the famous cancellation of the licenses, which led to a complete departure from the old way of sanctioning or giving spectrum into auctions. So thankfully this government has taken upon itself to do an auction on 25th of February. So we are all waiting to participate in that. We would have liked more spectrum to come in, but there seems to be a decision that the 15 megahertz of 3G spectrum and perhaps more will be done in the round 2 during the next financial year.
The previous government, and because of obviously what happened in 2010, was looking at telecom as a goose that lays golden eggs, almost killing the sector. This government also seems to be looking at telecom as a revenue maximization stream. Does that disappoint you?
You know,
or is that a reality you're willing to live with?
I think it's a reality. If you look around the globe, spectrum has become a source of revenues for many governments, both developed and the developing. There are models which have been very different from the models that we are following. China, for example. China Mobile and other operators have been given tons of spectrum, free of charge, with a commitment from them that they will roll out networks.
That's right.
So the result of that is China Mobile has rolled out 700,000 base stations in 4G. They will get to 1 million base stations this year. India, on the other hand, is spending a lot more on spectrum and rolling out much smaller amount of base stations in the network. So it's a trade-off, but in the end, no model is right or wrong. They're different models.
Is it a possibility that telecom operators like yourselves, who are market leaders, who call the shots, who set the trend, will decide to boycott this 3G spectrum? Why get into this unnecessary war out to each other in a scarcity-induced spectrum auction in any case?
No, I think boycotting spectrum is not the answer. You have to participate. As players, what's my lifeline? My lifeline is spectrum. Without spectrum, we have no life. So we have to participate. And eventually consolidation in the sector will ensure that there are few players who can make an economic case of their services. The good news is the consumption of both minutes and data in India is very high. Therefore, even if there is a price readjustment, it will not be something that will be onerous for the customers.
But Mr. Mittal, there's an obvious consumer angle to all of this, which seems to be missing the argument as both sides make those arguments. Higher spectrum costs will result into higher consumer services. Is that something that you can deny?
But that's what I'm saying. Thankfully, the scale is so much that the marginal adjustments of tariffs over a period of time is not going to hurt the customer. Let's assume 10 paisa more per minute or 5 paisa more per megabit is going to be megabyte is going to be charged from the customer. It's not going to create a big hole, but the amount of contribution that flows through can then justify some of these auction prices.
You began talking about the 3G spectrum and how 15 megahertz is going to be available only at a later stage. The regulator says that you should put up for auction all that is available, even if it comes at a later date. Isn't that a potent argument? Shouldn't the government have gone by that?
I think we all are agreeing. It appears to me that the government is also agreeing with that. All they're saying is we want to do 2 steps instead of 1 step. And we are fine. I mean, as long as the government is committed to bringing in that next round, in the next financial year, I think one can plan their life around that.
You know, we're discussing 3G, but what about 4G? Why has that not taken off? Everybody seems to be still struggling on the ground for that to really pick up.
Things are moving. We have got 14 cities which are running. Some of them are doing reasonably well now. Ecosystem of 4G, especially the TD side, where India has started off, has taken longer to develop. But I'm very pleased to see the developments in China now. TD is flourishing. More handsets are coming, more dongles are coming, more devices are coming. I think in 12 to 18 months, you will see a lot of activity.
At the cost of sounding repetitive, will Reliance's entry change the dynamics in this space?
Well, I think it creates a better ecosystem. One person alone cannot, take the entire load of a new ecosystem. More players will mean more devices, more networks, cheaper networks, and a much, much better and enabling ecosystem for the market. So from our point of view, there needs to be 3 or 4 people who are going to drive the 4G piece as well.
When do you expect pricing power to return to telecom operators like yourselves?
Well, that's hard until the consolidation takes place. If you look at the voice side, despite very heavy pricing of spectrum paid in the last 4 or 5 years, I think the pricing has been able to go up by only 2 or 3 paisa. So you can imagine the intensity of competition. And that's where the government should, really be happy that here's a sector which generates tremendous amount of revenues for the government in terms of auction, license fees, spectrum charges, and yet is one of the lowest price tariffs anywhere in the world.
My next guest is someone who has for long insisted that Achhe Din are finally here. My next guest, of course, is Uday, Kotak, and he has for long maintained that good times are here for the Indian economy. I questioned him on the RBI's policy rate cut. I also asked him how much rate cut does he expect in this entire calendar year, and whether this is a decisive turn in the rate cut cycle for India, and most importantly, will this spur demand and also boost investments? Uday, Kotak with ET Now.
I think the challenge for India is how do you transform vision into structural architecture before project management.
That's right, yes.
And the next 90 days, I would wish that the Indian policymakers focus on structural architecture, because I think we've got our Prime Minister with wonderful vision.
That's right.
He's got a team which has got excellent project management skills.
That's right.
The structural architecture piece is what we really need to get from here.
And it looks like adding to that party is Raghuram Rajan also. He's done his bit. He's cut rates by 25 basis points. I want to be the contrarian and ask you this question. This was long time waiting. Do you believe it's too little, too late?
My view is you've moved in a particular direction. And I think through 2015, my expectation is 75 to 100 basis points cut, which means a repo rate of around 7%.
That's right.
And my estimate of inflation by January 2016, if oil and some of the other commodities remain low, around 5 to 5.5%.
Is this a decisive turn in monetary policy, and will it also spur, investments, so to say, which is the one big reason everybody was crying for as far as cost of credit goes?
My sense is investment will be a little more back-ended. And that is where I think the government architecture point in the next 90 days is going to be crucial. And this time around, for India's sake, I hope we get more roads before we get more cars.
As far as the reform route is concerned, the government has gone ahead and tapped the ordinance route. There are two ways to look at it. Does it inspire confidence? Because the government believes political opposition cannot stall reforms. The flip side to that argument is that should investors be worried that there will always be political rhetoric, always be political opposition to reforms in India?
No, I think this government is much more decisive. Therefore, it has made up its mind to do a few things. It will go ahead and do it. And I have no doubt about that. It's a matter of time. It's not if, it is when.
What would you expect Finance Minister Jaitley to do to take this story forward that we've just spoken about?
I think the budget is going to be a big event. It's going to be a statement by the Modi government. So it's going to have a pretty detailed planning of the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister and the entire government. So think about this as a major event in the policy making framework, since it is the first true budget.
That's right, the first full year budget of this government.
Therefore, in addition to the fisc and the math of the fisc, the directional architectural piece is what I'm looking forward to.
Let's move on to the fiscal deficit piece. Governments in the past, at least with Mr. Chidambaram, have lost a lot of sleep over this for the right reasons, because we saw a huge fiscal slippage happen with Mr. Mukherjee. But given the fact that we need growth, and it is non-negotiable that we need growth, should the Indian government now focus on, pushing public investment, which may result into fiscal slippage? And will the rating agencies that everybody keeps talking about and everybody is so wary about really buy that point? Because there seems to be some gathering of space on this.
My sense is we are in for a marathon. Therefore, let's not just do something which is a sprint. We need more growth, but we need patience. You have an international situation which is reasonably deflationary. So in the context of that, my sense is a more gradually upward sloping economic growth cycle, not a hockey stick.
That's it then on this edition of Davos Direct. We will continue to get you fresh faces, new topics, and plenty more that's happening at the World Economic Forum. Till we meet you tomorrow evening, it's a goodbye from the entire team here.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.